The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 5. Completed. Highness Dasmir Ilamabad III was a monarch who he managed to keep his little kingdom rich in gems, independent and free from the clutches of the great kingdom of Olbiana. His strategy was risky and reckless. He managed to make his kingdom key in the Dragon's Ridge. Afterwards he remained faithful to his long-standing allies, which in the long run brought him great benefits. It was unfortunately his end, murdered by a usurper, but he was avenged by the rightful heir to the throne of Demember. Dynasties of the Kingdom of Demember. Anonymous. The great capital of the Kingdom of Beer welcomed them with open doors. Never before had Arian been in such a large, cosmopolitan, and populous city. She discovered that Tame was a very busy city not only for the people of the Kingdom of Beer, but for people from all over the world. The number of races that Arian observed along the way was impressive. Many of them were totally unknown to the young woman. The Kendali was frightened by being surrounded by so many people unknown to her. She was used to traveling with her parents in the safety of their wagon, so many people around her. Her ideal life was when she walked alone on the roads or in small groups. Agnorok was somewhat uncomfortable, but it was not something new to him, although he was quite withdrawn. The only one of the four who was calm and even jovial was the Denka, greeting everyone and stopping with anyone who would give him a chance to strike up a conversation. Because of this attitude of Gosberg, they advanced very slowly, but even so, when the sun was high in the sky, it was when they reached the gates of the city. The quartet paused for a moment to look at the gate and the wall. Arian, seeing them from a great distance as it happened yesterday, had deceived them. Now they realized the magnitude of the construction of the wall. It was enormous, gigantic. Its height was almost 20 meters high and it was covered with light blue tiles. The wall looked unreal as the sun shone on the tiles. Along every 500 yards of wall was erected a watchtower twice as high as the wall, and on which flew the blue and gold flag, which were the colors of the Kingdom of Beer. The gates were simple, made of oak wood, reinforced with iron that protected the entrances to the city and were closed only at night. By land the city could only be entered through 3 gates, one to the north of the wall, one to the south, and the last to the east. The group was in front of the east gate, perhaps the busiest, as it was the closest to the city's huge market, where the fruit of Beer's wealth, iron, was actually traded. Because of his iron, the King of Beer was one of the most influential people in the world, even though his kingdom was located so far north, next to the eternal snows. Beer was the only kingdom with an abundance of iron ruled by men, except for those of the Black Empire. The rest of the deposits were located within the domains of the dwarfs and they traded very little and at high prices with men. The only exception was the great kingdom of Olbiana. Moreover, since the King of Beer centralized northern trade only through Xeres by prohibiting maritime trade, his capital became more important. The king could better control his monopoly of the iron trade. Smuggling was a minor issue, although the king had to control it, but not extinguish it, as it could provoke a rebellion in the north. If a free city in the north went too far or increased the number of boats with which it smuggled, the king would send a punitive raid, but for the moment the system was in a situation of some equilibrium. Many ambassadors and kings went to Tame to ask the king for some of his desired iron. Such was the demand that the king had to decide to whom he would grant a consignment of his ore. And one of the many rulers who was at Tame to solicit a cargo of iron was the King of Demember, who was now installed in one of the beautiful villas, which the King of Beer had reserved for his most distinguished guests. Tame was not only a city of commerce, it was also a very beautiful city. The great commercial activity had not ruined its large parks and this careful aesthetic of huge avenues rich in gardens full of trees. The city also had an ideal location. It was located in the middle of a beautiful bay with a large inlet where ships could anchor safely. The sides of the bay were crowned by two large mountains. On the mountain that was located in the north was the royal castle, and on the mountain facing south its slope was decorated by small palaces, and in one of the most luxurious was where the king of Demember was staying. After carefully observing the city walls, they advanced again and finally entered the city of the huge gate, the two girls staring in astonishment at everything they witnessed. As they entered the city through the wall, they were greeted by a wide avenue, on the pavements of which were numerous stalls selling a variety of goods, and which were crowded with people eager to buy them at a discounted price. If they continued walking along the great avenue, they would reach the great port of Thame and the center of the iron trade. But Gosberg took a detour south through another huge avenue that led them to the South Mountain where the villas were located. Arian and Vanus were slow to react. For them this was something new. They were not used to seeing so much movement of people and goods. The young Gosberg was surprised again by his tranquility and naturalness in front of so many crowds. A detail that amazed him was the number of languages he knew. He greeted many people, most of them in the common language, but he had no problem speaking in lesser-known dialects. Little by little, they moved away from the busiest neighborhoods and into the residential neighborhoods where the number of people was much smaller and the streets were narrower. Then they began to climb the South Mountain through a magnificent cobbled causeway, and as they climbed it they could at last see an extraordinary view of the bay. Arian and Vanus exclaimed in surprise. They had to stop. They had never seen anything like it and would never really see it again. In the middle of the sea loomed a huge wall that protected Thame Bay from one end to the other. It was really impressive, big, huge. If Arian didn't miscalculate its height, it was more than 40 meters high above the sea, but it wasn't a complete wall. Every 500 meters there was an arch that was protected by iron bars that prevented any ship from entering the bay. As the Great Wall of Land had great watchtowers crowned by the blue and gold banners, thanks to this magnificent construction no ship could enter or leave without royal permission. "It's amazing!" exclaimed Arian, who had been speechless for a few seconds admiring the huge structure that appeared in front of them. It was like a dream. "It's unbelievable, isn't it?" Gosberg continued. "It is not the fruit of man's hand." "Who, then?" Arian asked curiously to the Denker. "Who could have built something like that?" "Elves. Elves of the first era. There are hardly any constructions left from those times. This bridge is a small sample." "A bridge? But it's a wall." "No, it was a bridge. It is what remains of the Great Northern Bridge that linked the kingdom of the Northern Elves with the kingdom of the Southern Elves. The inscriptions are erased from the rock. Over the centuries, the inhabitants of Thame transformed it into this defensive construction that protected the bay from any maritime attack." The Denker turned and seemed unwilling to comment further on the subject, and resumed his march in silence. The young woman and the Kendeli followed him, but always keeping their eyes on the bridge of the elves. Agnorak spat on the ground. Elves, that he didn't like those conceited clowns. "Welcome home again, Gosberg." One of the guards greeted the Denker affectionately. "Thank you, Asaim," replied the Denker, as he gave a warm hug to the guard who had greeted him and who forced him to drop the spear and shield he was carrying to embrace him in the same way. "Gosberg, I hope you have succeeded in your mission. The king is in a worse and worse mood and the situation is starting to get serious for everyone." The Denker smiled nonchalantly again, and this reassured Arian. "Don't worry, this is easier than beating you at cards." The two guards smiled at the Denker's remark, but it was only Arian who addressed the Denker. "Yes, you wouldn't stop plucking even your mother. Damn Denker." And the trio smiled again. Before the astonished gaze of Arian, Agnorak and the Kendeli watched the scene from a distance. The half-orc did not like card games since as women used to create a lot of trouble. "No, I would leave my mother with a jacket to get dressed, but she would never end up naked." The Denka joked again, and the three of them laughed out loud again, but Gosberg regained his composure and said goodbye to the two guards. Well, I have business to attend to inside, so I must leave you. Just one thing. Those two women who accompany you, who are they? They are the solution to the problem that afflicts our beloved king. And without another word to the two guards, they let Gosberg and his companions into the villa. It was a simple two-story rectangular palace with large windows surrounded by small gardens. Once they reached the entrance door to the building, they advanced with determination. Gosberg seemed not to hesitate at any time. His three companions, however, were increasingly nervous. Many of the people he met on his way greeted the Denka, but he passively returned the greeting with a simple gesture of his hand and did not respond to anyone's greetings. Seeing how people allowed this attitude of the Denka without giving it much importance, as something usual in Gosberg. Some even took it as a joke. Arian confirmed something he suspected: the Denka must be someone truly important. After this hurried walk through the interior of the villa, the quartet came to a huge room, the walls covered with white marble, where at the end of this room was a huge wooden door of a shiny black color. It seemed illogical, but no one guarded it, even though it had to lead to the king's private apartments. The Denka walked up to the door staring at it, and when it looked like he was about to open it, he stood still in front of it, hesitating whether or not to open the door. He did nothing, remained motionless, and then Gosberg cast a glance at Arian, as if looking for a solution in the girl's eyes, but the young woman did not understand the attitude of the Denka, who a few moments ago had been so determined to enter at the sight of the king. At last Gosberg regained his confidence and took a deep breath, looked resolutely at the doorknob, and placed his right hand on it. But just as he was about to open the door, it opened from the inside, and a man came out of the room and closed the door very quickly. At the astonished gaze of the Denka, who had to jump backwards so as not to collide with the man who was watching the interior of the room in terror, so quick was the gesture that it seemed as if there were a horrible monster inside the room. Once the door was slammed shut, the man breathed a sigh of relief and then wiped the sweat from his forehead and once recovered. He watched the quartet staring at them in surprise. He was an elderly man, tall and dark, like the rest of the inhabitants of the village, with grey hair and a well-groomed beard. His eyes were blue, but they were full of terror, and he wore a simple white robe of navy blue cotton. When he recovered from his surprise at meeting three strangers, he smiled with relief when he saw that the Denka was there. Gosberg! The man exclaimed with joy. Praise the gods, you are back, thanks to Kukmosin. The man hugged the Denka desperately. Gosberg froze. He did not expect such an effusive reaction from a person who normally behaved in a very serious way. Losgama, what's going on? Gosberg asked strangely. The king, when suffering these horrible pains, so great, causes his mood to be terrible. Losgama replied with terror and concern. Is it that bad? Yes. Losgama confirmed. Your mood swings are sudden and so terrible that no one is safe. Seems serious. You've already ordered for mailboxes to be beheaded. Losgama added in a panic, then looked at the door again in fear. Go. Your stomach must hurt well. Losgama looked at the two young women for a moment with some surprise, and then looked at Gosberg in amazement. Who are these two girls who are with you? Gosberg glanced at Arian and Vanus, then smiled slightly. Some people I met during my trip to Xeres. But Gosberg and the doctor you were supposed to go and find in Xeres. Did you find it? The Denka smiled nervously at Losgama's questions about the outcome of his mission on Xeres. Yes, I did, indeed. Losgama breathed a sigh of relief. Good news at last in these horrible weeks, but one assailed the man at that moment, who reflected it looking anxiously at the Denka, before asking in a desperate tone of voice. Well, why isn't he here with you? Gosberg smiled again, a little nervously, and scratched the back of his right hand nervously, before giving an explanation to Losgamer. The doctor is unable to travel. He has suffered from an illness that prevents him from moving out of his city for the time being. Gosberg replied calmly to the utter astonishment of Arian, who knew the truth of the situation. Agnorak lowered his head in embarrassment. Losgamer had a look of astonishment on his face at the news of the Denka, and his face again showed nervousness. What kind of disease? How long will it take to reset? The man asked Gosberg nervously. For quite some time I believe in being completely cured. But what is the disease? A sword wound. How serious is it? Mortal. Losgamer almost fell to the ground when he heard the Denka. Mortal. He's dead. Yes, dead, an accident. Losgamer sat down on the floor and began to cry inconsolably like a little child. Arian wondered what kind of person it was that made his prime minister cry inconsolably. Gosberg approached Losgamer, who was the person who proposed the idea of fetching the doctor from Xeres, and patted him on the back to comfort him. Calm down, Losgamer, I have a solution. The tone of the Denka was very kind and hopeful. The prime minister stopped crying and stared at the Denka. You have an idea. What is it? These two ladies will take care of the king's health. Losgamer studied the young women again with some hope, but then looked at Gosberg with suspicion. And what knowledge do they have? Are they healers? Magas? Medical? Actually, I don't know. But do you have experience in these matters? Losgamer was on the verge of a heart attack. Gosberg smiled nervously again. No, I don't think so. But for the Prime Minister, this whole situation was beyond him. Calm, Losgamer. The Denka stared into the Prime Minister's eyes. You know me, when has a plan of mine gone wrong? Trust me. Gosberg tried to use all his power of conviction. Losgamer did not open his mouth, looked at the Denk for a moment, got up and ran out of the mansion to the outside while screaming hysterically. We're dead, we're all dead. The group was left alone, Arian looking suspiciously at the Denka as they knew that when Gosberg opened that door they would be risking their lives. Gosberg sat down on the floor to think about his current options. Certainly the conversation with Losgamer was not very reassuring. What are we going to do? Arian asked nervously, already a little tired of Gosberg's own doubts about his plan. The Denka stared at her and smiled mockingly, got up and with a very quick movement opened the door resolutely and confidently as if the conversation with Losgamer had never happened. Arian and Vanus looked at each other hesitantly, but in the end they decided to enter the room following the Denka, though with a much more cautious attitude than Gosberg's. Agnorak hesitated for a moment but followed the Denka after all. Sooner or later they had to see the king, it was their job. Arian didn't know what to make of this situation. She knew it was risking a lot. The king seemed very powerful and in a rather changeable mood. If he cured him of his illness he could have the means of escaping from beer. But in case of failure, he would surely end up with his head inside a basket separated from the rest of his body. With these doubts the two young women entered the room and advanced slowly. It was a very large room, immense, much larger than the other room. The walls were also covered with white marble. It had large windows that made it well lit. It overlooked a beautiful garden full of fruit trees and exotic trees. It was decorated with huge multicolored cushions on the floor and colorful, pleasant-looking rugs.
It looked like a palace out of those fairy tales Loaf told her when she was little. There was no peace and happiness in that room. There was a huge tension. There was a dead silence even though there was a large crowd to their right, but they didn't pay any attention to them when they entered. Those people were dark and tall, wearing colorful robes but just watching Gosberg intently in silence. The Denka had advanced to the center of the room and was standing still, right in front of a huge circular bed bowing so wide that Gosberg's head almost touched the floor. Agnorok was behind the Gosberg. The two young women stopped a few feet behind him and listened to a shrill voice speak to the Denka. "My dear Gosberg, you have come back at last. This has been hell during the weeks of your absence," said the voice, showing joy at Gosberg's presence. Arian tried to see who was in the bed, but it was completely covered with opaque silk curtains, which prevented him from seeing who was inside. Surely if he stood at Gosberg's level he could see what the king was like, but for the moment he decided to keep the Kendali in the background and listen to the Denka's conversation with the king. "I know, my lord, but I'm back, you have nothing more to fear," Gosberg replied smugly, so much so that Arian seemed to him in very bad taste, given the state of affairs. Thank you. My stomach hurts so much that I can't sit up. I spend the whole day prostrate in this demonic bed. What an ordeal," complained the monarch in a tired voice. "I know, my lord." The Denka took pity on the king very kindly. "Have you been successful in your mission? Have you managed to bring that doctor to cure me of this disease?" the monarch asked with some hope. The Denka smiled nervously again, as in the previous conversation with Losgamer. Arian looked at him expectantly. She wanted to know how the Denka got out of this very compromising situation. "My lord, I have some bad news to give you." "That's bad news, dear Gosberg." The monarch's voice now had a certain tone of anger. Arian could see how the people who were part of the royal entourage and were inside the room were startled by the king's tone of voice at the bad news of the Denka. It was as if a black shadow seemed to pass within the room, filling everyone with despair. If the monarch did not recover soon from his illness, his bad mood could have terrible consequences for his entire entourage. At last Gosberg went on with his plan, after the first part of it had succeeded. "Don't worry, my lord, I, your dear and most faithful servant, have found a solution to your problems that make me so sad." "A solution? My dear Gosberg, tell me, what do you offer me?" The king's voice had a hopeful tone. Gosberg moved forward until he reached the height of the bed. She drew the silk curtains and knelt right in front of the king. Arian could now see him clearly. He was much younger than she had imagined, middle-aged, had a round figure. And his blue eyes looked at Gosberg with sympathy and affection. The Denka must have been someone who was highly regarded by the monarch. Gosberg spoke to the king in a very calm tone that inspired a good deal of confidence to listen to. "In Xeres I found a very famous healer, my lord, and I have persuaded her to come here to treat you." "That's good news. Tell him to come closer," exclaimed the monarch with joy at the good news of his servant, his eyes shining with hope. The Denka looked at the two young women confidently, and with a wave of his right hand motioned for Arian and Vanus to go to him, standing just in front of where the monarch was prostrate. The two of them moved forward slowly and little embarrassed, as they knew that all eyes in the room were now on the two of them at this moment. Agnorok moved forward alongside them but remained a little withdrawn. Arian reached the height of the Denka and now watched the king from closer. His skin was brown, his head was as she had seen before, round and bald, but he had a kind expression about it. His plump figure lay fully stretched out on the big bed, though he was now slightly upright to see Arian and Vanus more comfortably. The young woman was surprised that he was someone who inspired so much fear because of his good-natured appearance. The king looked closely at the two girls with some surprise, and then went to Gosberg. "This is the healer you're talking about?" The king was not very confident of the girls. "Yes, my lord. They don't look like much." The king was disappointed. He expected something else more spectacular. Gosberg smiled nervously again. "But, my lord, she's not just any healer. You don't see that he has a Kendali as an assistant." "A Kendali?" exclaimed the king in surprise. The monarch studied the Kendali, who stood there with those yellow eyes staring at the monarch who had only heard of them but had never seen one in person. Gosberg then approached the two young women and placed his boat on Arian's shoulder to give him a show of support. "Trust me, my lord. They will cure your illness." The king looked at Gosberg with some suspicion and closed his eyes heavily. "All right, my dear Denker." The king accepted with resignation as it was the only solution he had at the moment.
Gosberg, I hope they don't make me angry like the previous ones. Those slaughterers wanted me to stop eating my lambs and my delicious sweets. That's how they ended up with their heads cut off. Arian, hearing that, looked worriedly at the Denker, but he could only smile slightly. "Don't worry, it's just a joke." Gosberg shoved the young woman to encourage her to examine the king. Arian walked slowly until he came to where the king was lying, and sat down beside him. The monarch watched intently in silence. Arian began to do what he had done so many times in Caesarea. With one right hand he touched the belly of the monarch and soon found the cause of his terrible ailments. It was a great embarrassment, not rather a terrible intoxication, that made him uneasy. But since the king was a stubborn man, he continued to maintain his diet with so much food load and probably very heavy. That made me worse every day and in such severe pain. He had to get his patient to stop eating, but how? The monarch had ordered the execution of those doctors who had suggested it, and that was the only solution. Arian realized he was in a bit of a bind. "And well, dear?" the king asked anxiously, "do you know how to solve the problem that afflicts me?" Arian drew a blank. He didn't know what to answer. The solution was simple, but he couldn't say it because it would seal his fate. The king would cut off his head, Gosberg, this one deservedly, and the Kendali. Perhaps Agnorak could escape from there by not being so close to them. "My dear, you don't listen to me." The king insisted again in a tone that was beginning to show a certain impatience with her. Arian had to answer something now. For the king was about to lose his patience. "Take my lord." A very characteristic whisper interrupted Arian's dark thoughts, Her Majesty gazing in amazement at someone behind her. Arian turned his head in surprise to whoever interrupted his conversation with the king. It was the Kendali that offered the monarch a cup with a mysterious liquid and emitted a very strange smell that Arian did not know. "What is this?" asked the monarch, surprised, looking at what the Kendali offered him. "An infusion that the lady has ordered me to prepare to relieve her discomfort." The king took the cup with some reservations, looked at the liquid it contained, and then sniffed the infusion suspiciously. Then he took a small sip. The three adventurers, like the rest of the room, watched with great anticipation the reaction of the monarch, who did not seem to dislike the taste much, since after a small sip of tasting, he drank the rest greedily, in one gulp. Once the tea had been drunk, the king handed the cup to the Kendali and closed his eyes in satisfaction. An expectant silence reigned in the room, waiting for the outcome. After a moment the king opened his eyes and smiled with a great gesture of relief. "How does my lord feel?" Gosberg asked, who was the only one in the room with courage and enough nerve to address His Majesty, although the Denka was quite doubtful of the effect of the infusion. "Unbelievably good!" the king exclaimed. "It's a miracle. My stomach doesn't hurt anymore." The king was overjoyed, and got out of bed to embrace Arian and Vanus and congratulate them effusively. Thank you, you have made a poor sick man happy." At the same time he gave them kisses and hugged the surprised young women, especially Arian, who did not expect this miraculous recovery from the patient. The entourage inside the hall breathed a sigh of relief. If the king was recovered there was no longer any danger. But Vanus turned back to His Majesty. "You should drink this infusion every 6 hours, but you can only eat once a day." Then the gestures of relief turned into gestures of terror and panic. Gosberg almost fell down with fright. Agnorak put his hand to his sword, while the monarch stared at the Kendali. "It will be done as you have ordered." This answer astonished everyone, even the Denka, who couldn't help but open his mouth. "Besides, you will be my guests while you treat me," the monarch announced as he lay back on his bed. "Send for Losgama, who will give you some dignified quarters." Two subjects rushed out of the room to immediately carry out his orders, the king ordering the music to be played again and to be fanned. Everything seemed to be back to normal, and with a gesture he motioned for Gosberg to come closer, which the Denka did quickly, bowing again. "My dear and esteemed Denka, like my father and grandfather, you have once again proved to be a friend of great value. It has been a pleasure, my lord. You should know that Dubok will be happy to know that in your final fees you will have a generous reward for this extraordinary management of yours. I don't deserve it, my lord, for me to serve you." Gosberg thanked the reward with a feigned annoyance that fooled no one. Who was this little Denka who had the ability to get out of the most complicated situations with flying colors? He was a very cunning being, this talking bear with a face that had not broken a plate. Agnorak, on the other hand, breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't know how, but they had saved his ass, at least for the moment. In the town all tranquility returned, the king had recovered his health and good humor, and soon they would leave for his kingdom in the south. The next few days were quiet. Arian found some security within the walls of the villa, where all his wishes were fulfilled as the monarch had ordered. In addition, the king's health had improved so miraculously that after 4 days he was even eating a normal diet, although he always took the infusion after meals. Arian knew that the credit was not his. The miraculous recovery was due to the Kendali. She was the one who provided the king with the mysterious infusion. Vanus saved everyone's lives as Arian didn't know what to do at the time. The Kendali was a huge enigma to her, and although they shared a room at Arian's own request and conversed fluently, the Kendali maintained a rather reserved attitude about her and her past. She was always dressed in a black robe that completely covered her body and never left her. He only showed that faint whisper with which he spoke and those two big yellow eyes with cat-like pupils that watched everything attentively and penetratingly. For a few days he didn't see much of Gosberg. In fact, he finally realized the importance of the Denka. It was he who was in charge of supervising the king's security. He had the entire palace guard under his orders. Agnorak sometimes stopped by to visit them, but the visits were short and spaced out. Arian was pleasantly surprised, perhaps Gosberg if he was as famous as he claimed to be. As he thought these things, Arian watched from his room the beautiful Bay of Tame and that huge elven bridge, which was now a wall. He thought it was so beautiful that he never tired of looking at it. She had no complaints about her apartments, which were spacious and well-lit, nor about the treatment she received, as the king's servants treated her as a member of the royal family. Arian kept thinking about how lucky he had been to end up like this since his hasty escape from Caesarea. "What are you thinking about?" He heard that characteristic whisper that took him out of his thoughts as always. Arian turned around and looked at her interlocutor in surprise. The Kendali stared at her sitting in front of her, wrapped in that robe. "Not at all, Vanus. I was reflecting on everything that has happened to me in these months in my life." The Kendali was silent, staring at her with these strange yellow eyes with the pupils of a cat. Arian lowered his gaze and then looked out the window at the landscape of the bay again. "It's very beautiful what the elves built," Arian commented absently. "Everything elves do is beautiful. Have you seen elves?" The Kendali got up from her bed to sit down next to Arian's and could see that although Vanus was usually similar in height to Gosberg, she could change her height. She was now much taller. It was possible that the Kendali could modify its size at will. Yes, I have seen elves, my parents, and I performed for them a long time ago. Your parents? Do you miss them? Ever since Gosberg rescued her from the bandits, it was the first time Arian had asked her about them, as she had never dared to ask him anything about it. He thought the memories must still cause the Kendali a great deal of sadness. But now seemed like an ideal time to talk about them. If I miss them very much, those filthy bandits killed them and forced me to be a slave, until you freed me, so I will never be separated from you. You don't have to, you have a life to live, you shouldn't depend on anyone. Arian refused to let Vanus be his slave or servant. I don't have anyone anymore. My parents were expelled from my home and they were the only family I had. They both stared at each other for a moment. The Kendali had suffered too much in her life. She had lost her entire family in the attack of those bandits. Arian had lost her parents, but so young that she could barely remember anything about them. The young woman tenderly hugged the Kendali to give her support. Now that they both had time to reflect on what had happened in the last few weeks, they could try to heal some of their heart wounds. The king was very generous to his two benefactors, showered them with gifts and praise, and even held a banquet in their honor for their great work in resolving His Highness's illness. The two sat next to the king and Gosberg in the most prominent place of the banquet. Agnorok wasn't there as he was on guard, so he watched the celebration from a distance. The food they were served was not very much to the taste of Arian and the Kendali, as the typical dishes of Demember were too spicy and exotic for their taste. As soon as they tasted a morsel, only a little bread and fruit. Gosberg didn't eat much either, but it wasn't really because the food wasn't to his taste, rather it was due to the huge amount of wine he was able to ingest. Arian had never seen anyone drink that way, it was unbelievable. His Majesty, too, seemed to enjoy the feast, eating heartily, and of all the dishes served to him, which were very numerous and varied now that his stomach was fully recovered. The atmosphere of the dinner was very pleasant. Simple music sounded that gave harmony to the atmosphere and made the evening pass in a very relaxed tone. At the end of the supper the king rose to say a few words, and all present were silent. My dear friends, I want to thank you again for your help. If it weren't for you I would still be bedridden. Then there was a succession of cheers and applause from all those present at the banquet, for thanks to them they had saved their necks. Arian and Vanus bowed their heads timidly. The only one who stood up to say hello was Gosberg, though he was unable to keep his balance. The applause lasted so long that Arian had to stand up to say thank you. It was nothing, he said modestly as the Kendali fell silent. His Majesty Dasmir Ilanarban II was a monarch accustomed to luxury, which meant that when he traveled, he was accompanied by a large entourage. Many of his wives and daughters traveled with him in addition to a large number of servants and slaves. Apart from the soldiers who took care of the security of the king and his entourage, but also thanks to his fortune he could hire the services of the best mercenaries in the world. And the company of the Blue Phoenix was his favorite. Dinner came to desserts, where His Highness seemed to enjoy much more. Arian took advantage of that moment to clear up some doubts he had about the reason for the trip to Tame. Even with a good supply of soldiers and mercenaries, for a king to leave the kingdom must have been for a very important reason. Excuse me, Your Majesty, can I ask you a question? Gosberg stopped drinking in his tracks at the young woman's question. The king stood in silence for a moment watching her, and then smiled slightly. "Yes, my dear, ask what you want. As I understand it, Demember is a country far from the south, beyond the ocean. So, I may ask you, what are you doing in this faraway kingdom with all your people?" His Majesty smiled again at Arian's obvious question and replied affably. "My dear, what do we do so much about our home? Well, it's simple. We come to look for something we need and that can be vital for us in the far south. But what have you come to this beautiful city for?" "Iron, my dear. We need iron. A kingdom in the south prevents us from buying what little iron was for sale by the dwarfs." "Iron!" Arian exclaimed. "Who doesn't need iron in this cruel age? The kingdom of beer has iron to mountains, and it's something I need. That is why we are here, waiting for a large shipment that the king has given me to transport to our kingdom. In addition, we both defeated those damned, greedy dwarfs who believe themselves to be the only ones who can exploit the mines. So a war is coming in the south." What Arian knew of the far south were rumors. There were numerous exotic kingdoms continually warring with each other. "We don't know, dear, but what we do know is that we will not allow the kingdom of Olbiana to blackmail us in exchange for our independence." The king uttered this last sentence with great firmness and determination. Arian, seeing the king's anger, decided that he must abandon this subject, and the dinner resumed in a friendly and relaxed tone. Gosberg told a story of a boat trip and a mysterious island of bird women nesting in trees taller than the Tame Bridge. The king and the other guests at the table of honor listened to the story in amazement, and at the end of the denka the king applauded enthusiastically. When the supper drew to a close, His Majesty turned to Arian and the Kendali. "My ladies, I want to ask you to accompany me on the journey back to my kingdom. I need your help to monitor the state of my health." The two young women were surprised, especially Arian. It was the opportunity he was waiting for and he did not hesitate. "It will be my pleasure, my lord, to accompany you." "Fantastic! So my trip will be very smooth." Then the king noticed the outfits of the two young women. They were the same as they had since they appeared in the villa, and noticed how the monarch heaved a sigh of disgust. "But your attire is inappropriate for someone who is going to be in my service." The king went to Gosberg, who was finishing with a new bottle of wine. "Gosberg, tomorrow accompany these two ladies to the great market of Tame and see that they buy themselves decent clothes." Gosberg smiled. He could leave the villa again, and it was time. He needed a break. Lately he was so busy that he couldn't make any getaways, and Tame had very interesting taverns to visit. "It will be a pleasure as always to carry out your orders, my great lord." With this order, the monarch ended the dinner and everyone went to rest. The next day, following the king's orders, the trio, plus Agnorak as an escort and a large group of servants, made their way to the great market of Tame. Tame Market was next to the harbor, consisting of a large number of street stalls and shops offering a huge variety of goods from all parts of Sharnaries. The sheer number of people who frequented the market was enormous. Arian felt as unprotected as the first day they entered Tame. In addition, the task of finding an outfit and garments worthy of the king's new doctors became hard work. The variety of garments on offer was immeasurable, and on the other hand, there was Gosberg's taste, which was very much his own. Agnorak took it with resignation. It was difficult to make Gosberg come to his senses, when he was also using the gold of a king who possessed a great fortune. Thus the morning passed between visits to the various stalls and with many discussions with Gosberg about what was appropriate and what was not, and what was usually solved with Gosberg buying all the garments. In the end Arian got tired of all the busyness. From inside the last place where they were shopping, Arian saw a small park located in the central part of the market. It consisted of a few trees and a small fountain that supplied with a small jet of crystal clear water. It was a little frequented place, since the crowd preferred to be in the stalls, eat something in the taverns and inns, or see some street shows. Without saying a word, he left that tent to rest his tired feet in that park. The young woman was relieved when she sat down on one of the wooden benches in the park and accompanied by the Kendeli, who sat next to her. The two looked laconically at Gosberg, who was arguing with a merchant about the price of green turbans. They were truly awful. Meanwhile, Agnorak seemed absorbed in looking at some black fabrics. In the end the Denka gave up his purchase, in the face of the exorbitant price that the merchant asked of him, so he went to where his companions were, to sit with them, although he was angry with the attitude of the seller. Agnorak stood inside the tent, staring at the black cloth. 40 gold coins for a turban. Gosberg was outraged. Arian watched the Denka wearily. I don't know why I buy so many things that are useless. Gosberg smiled. The king will be very offended if we don't get to the villa with a lot of packages. But Arian and the Kendeli weren't quite convinced by that argument. Surely the turban was for him, not for them. But the Denka paid no attention to them and changed his expression to one of joy. As he seemed to sniff something in the air, something very appetizing, and he licked his mouth. Arian was forced to ask. What happens now, Gosberg? White herb brandy. Distilled in the traditional beer way. Exclaimed the Denka quite excitedly. The Denka rose and ordered the servants to return to the king's villa with the articles they had purchased all this morning. Ladies, I'm going to see for a moment how such an exquisite drink is produced. Wait for me here. It won't be long. The Denka quickly disappeared, entering a small shop next to the park that looked rather suspicious. They both breathed a sigh of relief. Now they would have a moment of rest after such a hectic morning. Arian then saw the people coming in and out of the market stalls, the frenetic pace of the shoppers, the shouts of the merchants offering their wares. I listened to the music of the artists who offered it in exchange for some coin donated by some soul compassionate with their art. Then in the crowd he saw a figure he didn't expect to find in that place, right there. He recognized his white robe, his short, strong figure, with a menacing look. It was Doris, the wizard of Caesarea. She felt a shiver run down her spine and fear flooded her whole body. The magician didn't seem to recognize her. He was carefully observing some spices in a distant post. But even though it didn't seem that the magician didn't pay attention to her presence, Arian couldn't stay there sitting. She didn't want to be discovered by the magician and ran out of that place looking for a better hiding place. The Kendeli looked at her surprised and got up and left with her. At that very moment, as he stood up to escape, the magician turned his gaze slightly toward the park. He saw two figures hurrying out of the place. It was then that the magician recognized her and immediately stopped what he was doing to follow those two figures that were moving away from him. Maybe I was lucky, he thought as he watched the girls escape, and finally in time he would find the assassin he had been looking for months and who he thought had disappeared without showing any signs of life. He had found only a vague hint. For a month ago he had heard of a strange occurrence involving a Denka and a mysterious young woman, who must have been her, no doubt, but nothing more. Agnorak was bored of spending the whole morning looking at dresses and fabrics, but above all of putting up with the Denka, so he shut himself up in his thoughts, especially in the last shop where he noticed something he had not seen for a long time, the Malvasar cloth, which was typical of his hometown. His clothes had always been made with it. It was very resistant, it withstood rain and heat very well, it did not tear easily. In Almera he had a personal chest where he kept a t-shirt, trousers, and a doublet made of the same fabric. The touch with this fabric reminded me of the first time she wore pants made of this fabric, but this one was brown. When he raised his head to see if the girls were still sitting in the park, he didn't see them. That's when he had a bad feeling, put the cloth aside and ran off in search of Arian and the Kendali. Arian began to run, but her worst predictions came true. When she looked back she saw how the magician began to follow her, although slowly. Now she was in serious trouble. How unlucky! It couldn't be, now that he was so close to escaping. That wizard would catch her if she didn't run away. She instinctively thought of the blue jewel and her brother. The wizards must not know that his brother had it, so he must flee to warn him of the danger. Arian hesitated for a moment where to continue his desperate escape and decided to take the road that passed through a small alley. Surely it would lead to an exit from the market. He had to return to the king's villa. There he would be safe. But it was a mistake to enter that alley, as there was no way out and something much worse. There was nowhere to hide. There were only the 3 huge empty walls. The 2 of them walked up to the wall that blocked their way to freedom. Arian slammed the wall in anger. Luck had turned its back on her, and the young woman watched fearfully at the entrance to the alley, waiting from one moment to the next to see the figure of the magician. Vanus then grabbed her hand tightly, and Arian looked at her in surprise, but didn't open his mouth. The touch of the Kendali's hand was cold and velvety but firm. Vanus in his usual whisper commanded, "Hold on tight to my hand, stick as much as you can to the wall, and don't make the slightest noise." Arian only felt a strong heat coming from the Kendali and tried to do as Vanus had ordered. Darius calmly followed the 2 figures. He knew the market quite well and knew that they would not escape easily. If it was really that young woman, he would never thank the gods enough. He couldn't hide his triumphant smile as he watched as those 2 figures, who obviously didn't know Thames Market well, were entering a dead end. So he moved forward in a very serene way, savoring the moment, but once he entered the interior of the alley he could not hide his great disappointment. There was no one inside. It was impossible. He had seen them enter the alley and there was no way out. Climbing was in principle impossible, unless they were witches or had arcane powers. He walked over to the wall that closed the alley. He was frustrated. That damn little girl had slipped away again. It couldn't be. At least she was clear about her next step. That damn one would try to find a boat with which to leave Beer. He must have been pleased. This afternoon he would speak with the magician in charge of the Order of the White Robes of this city, who had great influence over the King of Beer. They would search every ship that left this city. It would be theirs and the jewel they were looking for as well. Satisfied by this idea, the wizard hurriedly left the alley to make his way to his order's headquarters in Thame. They had to be quick to prevent Arian's escape. Agnorak noticed the strange figure of a magician, a white robe. What a bunch of assholes. He didn't like magicians, but that sect certainly less. He decided to follow his instinct and followed that magician at a distance. Something told him that he was involved in the disappearance of the girls. When he saw Darius stop and smile before entering the alley, the half-orc hesitated whether he should kill him right then and there. Time against a mage was key. They had to be killed before they could recite a spell. There was no one to observe them, but it was a white robe and those mags used to have a lot of contacts and power. Killing him for no specific reason was foolhardy, so he stayed at a safe distance watching his steps. He saw how he entered the alley. The half-orc got as close as he could. It seemed that the wizard was quite angry about something. He expected to find something or someone in the alley, but it was completely empty. Agnorak knew that he was not far off the mark. After a few minutes, the wizard seemed to give up his search and left the alley at a hurried pace to disappear into the crowd of the market. The half-orc hesitated to follow him, but his priority was to find the 2 young women, since he did not know where they were. But the one whose whereabouts he did know very well was that of Gosberg, who would surely be in the tavern that was next to the fabric store. he would warn him and together they would look for his two friends. When Arian and Vanus came out of the alley, they ran to Gosberg, who was still in the room drinking quietly, while Agnorok stood beside him with a serious expression. The half-orc was waiting for the Denka to finish off his cup so he could go in search of him. Agnorok was very happy to see her again. He was frankly worried. You see, Agnorok, the most sensible thing to do was to stay here and wait for them. Gosberg told him without giving the slightest importance to what had happened. The eyes of the half-orc and the young woman met. Arian suspected that Agnorok knew something, but neither of them said anything, and as if nothing had happened they all returned to the villa. Although they were safe in the villa of the King of Demember, the fright for Arian was too great. He had to leave Tame immediately. But even so, the enormous power of the Kendali had her in awe. Something that seemed to make Vanus uncomfortable, who as always was reserved and shy. How did you do that, Ali? At last he asked Arian, who had avoided talking about the incident, but could no longer resist his curiosity about the Kendali's powers. Since they were alone in their room, Vanus was a little more open. It's a power that we Kendalis have. Vanus took off his robe for the first time and Arian could see her figure, well, her silhouette. Since she was like a black shadow in 3 dimensions, she was a woman with a slender silhouette, much taller than when she had the robe. She moved gracefully, but above all those yellow sclera eyes and large cat's pupils stood out. It's amazing! Arian exclaimed admiringly. It is a shadow spell that hides our traits. Our true nature is only revealed to other Kendalis. And with that said, the Kendali transformed into a huge eagle that perched softly on the bed. To Arian's astonishment, the eagle spoke with the characteristic whisper of the Kendali. We can transform into any animal or thing. That was the number my parents and I made. I was a huge eagle that transformed into a dragon. The Kendali reverted to its silhouette form of a young man. Arian couldn't react. He knew they were mysterious beings, but not that much. What actually happened in the alley is as follows. Vanus took a vase in his hands and closed his eyes. To the young woman's admiration, the Kendali and the vase disappeared, although they were surely inside the room. At that moment, without knocking, Gosberg entered the room. Good damsels, the Lasgama has told me that we will sail in a week's time. The Denk was silent, as if surprised and looking at a particular spot in the room. It was the place where Vanus and the vase had disappeared. Arian stared amused at the Denka who closed the door slowly, keeping an eye on the place where the Kendali had theoretically disappeared. The Kendali can be made invisible. Gosberg said matter-of-factly to a surprised Arian and Vanus, that Gosberg discovered Vanus had such an impact on the Kendali that she let go of the vase, the object fell, they heard the sound, and the pieces scattered on the floor appeared before them. It's unbelievable, babbled Vanus, still invisible. How did you discover me? The Denka smiled, said nothing, and lay down on the bed. I know a lot of things, dear, like your incident with that wizard in the alley. It seems that you managed very well. They were both stunned by Gosberg's revelation, and the Denka smiled again. I wouldn't be a good mercenary if I didn't notice those little details, my dears. Moreover, for your safety, I have requested His Majesty to travel with the retinue of his wives and daughters. That way you'll both be safer. Neither of them could say anything, but the Denka went on. Another thing I recommend is not to leave the village during this week. It seems that the White Robes have asked the King of Beer to look for a foreigner from the north. They did not want to say why they want his capture. When Gosberg had finished saying this and left the room, the Kendali and the young woman looked at each other and smiled. If a Kendali was a mysterious being or Arian had a past that he hid at all, they could be compared to the Denka, who surprised them anew every day. Outside the room the half-orc was waiting for Gosberg. He was the one who told his superior about the disappearance of the girls and the presence of the wizard in the white robes. Gosberg had contacts in the court of the king of Beer and was immediately informed that the head of the order in Beer had asked the king to search for and arrest a young woman from the north, red and bottled. Arian. Why are the white robes looking for Arian? Agnorek's question was obvious, but perhaps the answer was not so easy. Gosberg lit a cigarette. They are magicians. I doubt they are interested in a young woman. No doubt they are looking for something that she has or that they think she knows where she is. Agnorek was silent, although he thought they were. It was the most important order of mags in the world. If they were looking for Arian, it must be for something important. Don't worry, Agnorek, the gods will provide. For the time being, do not separate yourself from them at all times and make sure that they do not leave this villa. The following week passed quickly with preparations for the return trip to Demember. Arian then learned that after a short crossing of the Sea of Ice, a hard march along the mountain range of the Dragon's Ridge awaited them. It was the first time that a caravan used the old southern road again. The king's previous attempts to bring iron to the south had failed, as a result of the assaults of some bandits, so this time he personally took care of this mission, transporting in a huge caravan with the amount of iron necessary for his kingdom. The Kendali and Arian hardly saw Gosberg all week and seemed to be very busy supervising the security of the trip, but they listened to the Denka and did not leave the villa. They secluded themselves in their room. He also came up with another idea, to dress, although he didn't like the style, in the same way as the women in the king's entourage. The one who was with them as long as his occupations allowed was the half-orc, although there was a bit of tension between him and Arian. Agnorek knew she was hiding a secret, but he didn't comment on the matter. Though Arian knew that Agnorek was with them to keep an eye on them. The king liked the idea of his guests traveling with his family, although he did not understand how his guests did not agree to go with him to some of the events that were held in the city of Tame in honor of the king of Demember and his departure. So the day of departure arrived and Arian left the king's villa again with the rest of the entourage. When he arrived at the huge port, he observed how the king's guards searched any young man who tried to get on a boat, and when one was suspicious, he approached a white robe to ask him some questions. The white robes were very powerful mags. Now Arian realized they were able to mobilize the army of the king of Beer to search for a girl. For his part, Agnorek was intrigued as to what the hell Arian was up to for such a deployment in his quest. The guards did not even attempt to search the retinue of the king of Demember, as he was a solemn guest of his king, but when one of the magicians with some arrogance tried to search the king's family, Gosberg appeared and with a threatening tone warned him. "Bastard! How dare you insinuate that? These are the wives and daughters of His Majesty Dasmir Ilamabad II, the personal guest of the king of Beer. I should kill you right here and hang your stupid head from the mast of the king's ship so everyone can see how foolish you are." As he quickly drew a dagger from the wizard, Agnorek reminded the Gosberg that he had slain these wretched bandits. This threat was effective. No soldier or wizard came near the royal entourage. Arian embarked and remained in his cabin until they sailed from the harbor. It was Vanus who warned him to go up to the deck and watch the spectacle. At that moment the boat was passing under one of the huge arches of the Elf Bridge and everyone screamed in great amazement. Its immensity. The marble still retained its immaculate white and was very bright despite the thousands of years that had passed since its construction. You couldn't see the passage of time. It was much more beautiful seen up close and really stunning. Everyone looked at him with joy. Everyone except the Denka, who knew it was only a small memory of a very beautiful past. Once they had moved away from Tame and its wall built over the sea, most of them retired to their cabins. Only Arian now stared at the coast of Beer and thought of his home and the day he had said goodbye to his Caesarea at dawn. She cried for a moment, but turned and looked at the horizon, where the ship was heading again, heading for an unknown destination, as it had been in that dawn. He had to get to the south. He had to warn his brother of the danger he was in. And that was really what mattered to her, and for that reason she had lost everything and was now embarked on an adventure that she didn't know where it would end. Immersed in her thoughts, she noticed how someone stood next to her. It was the half-orc who wiped away her tears with his fingers. Arian smiled. "You don't need to tell me anything, but what the hell are you up to, Arian?" The young woman cried again and looked at the horizon but did not answer. Arian stood silently gazing at his longed-for sea. Agnorok hugged her, and they remained silent for a long time.